Hello, everyone. My name is Margaret Boyle. I'm an associate professor of Romance languages and literatures, and I'm the director for our Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies program. And on behalf of the Faculty Initiative for Health, Culture, and Society, I'm pleased to welcome all of you for our annual lecture series in disability and accessibility. This series first started in 2019, and it's brought to our campus a number of scholars and artists that help us engage with the field of critical disability studies and create space for conversations about accessibility, disability representation, and inclusion, both on our campus and our wider communities. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome to this conversation Dr. Chi-Wing Lau. He is an assistant professor of English at Kenyon College. His research and teaching focuses on the intersections between literature and medicine and the longer histories of disability and pathology. Travis is an active public scholar, having contributed recently to Synapsis, Public Books, and the LA Review of Books. He is also a published poet who writes about embodiment at the intersections of queerness and disability. His talk this afternoon is titled Painful Histories, Theorizing Pain and Disability. Welcome, Travis.
Hello, everyone. Before I start, I'm going to drop into the chat right now an accessibility document with the full script of my talk if you'd like to follow along. And I will go from there. And if there's any issues with that, please let me know either in the chat or privately. Here we go. All right. So I want to first express my sincerest thanks to Margaret Boyle, David Hecht, and the Accessibility Task Force, and the Faculty Initiative for Health, Culture, and Society at Bowdoin for this generous invitation to be in conversation with you all today. I'm so excited to know that this lecture series exists, and it means the absolute world to be a part of it as a junior faculty member, still figuring out what it means to be a disabled scholar, navigating the still deeply inaccessible academy that was never made for us in the first place. I make this point a lot in my teaching, and in many ways, students understand this better than some faculty administrators do because they actively engage with the accommodations process and often live with the consequences of inaccessible classrooms and campus environments. Disabled faculty are and remain, as Mel White-Chen has described it, the very unthinkable in the academy, because we are presumed not to be disabled enough to become faculty in the first place, but we are here. We have always been here. I have long resonated with disability studies scholar Tanya Tichkowski's definition of access as the, quote, interpretive relationship between bodies. My goal in this lecture, in my classroom, in my scholarship, is to enable as many body minds to engage in that interpretive relationship and collective knowledge making as possible. Access is never a rote set of boxes we check off, nor a set of compliances that allow us to claim diversity. Rather, it is a moving target that we adapt toward the needs of the specific body minds that share this room or any room. This matters whether we're in a Zoom call or together in the classroom or in a lecture hall. The pandemic, in my view, has only made clearer how important access is to the future of the collective work we do in the academy. I'm grateful to be having this conversation virtually, especially as we are navigating the worsening crisis in higher education and trying to translate the very practices that constitute and sustain academic culture into alternative yet viable forms. To be very clear, we have been trying to do this now for over 2 years, and realizing the limits of such translations of what we do, idealistic as we may be, in our expectations to simply, quote unquote, carry on in the face of profound political, moral, and logistical problems. With the challenges of such translation into the digital in mind, I want to begin with my usual access notes because access is never optional, especially in a virtual setting. While this presentation is being given remotely, I encourage you to inhabit now the space that you're in. Stand, sit down, spread out, stim, turn off your camera, and inhabit your body minds as fully as you need to during the course of this conversation. I am appreciative of the auto captioning for this session, but to supplement this, the full script of this talk is available in the link, which I will link again in case some of you are just joining us now. If there are other ways I can make this talk accessible to you, please let me know. I look forward to engaging with you during the Q&A discussion, in the Zoom chat, or whichever way is most accessible to you. My hope today is to reflect on the commitments and investments that tie the very different facets of my life as a scholar poet. In what follows, I'll be sharing a bit of my very nascent project on the British literary and cultural histories of chronic pain in the 18th and 19th centuries in relation to my own formation as a queer and crip poet. Rather than simply present an overview of these different projects, I want to think out loud about how I arrived at these projects in the first place and what larger questions and approaches underpin them. To that end, I welcome your feedback as I imagine the Q&A to be an opportunity to learn from you in response to how I'm conceptualizing my projects and their possible futures. Some of you may know that I'm currently in the process of working on my first book, Insecure Immunity, Inoculation, and Anti-Vaccination in Britain, 1720 to 1898, which explores the long history of what I term inoculation insecurity, a term I'm using to refer to a spectrum of political and cultural anxieties surrounding the legitimacy, safety, and efficacy of preventative medicine during the long 18th and 19th centuries. In that project, I'm particularly interested in the limits of the binaristic pro and anti-vaccination model that actually bypasses some of the most messy ideological underpinnings of both of these positions that share a cultural imaginary. From a disability standpoint, my project wants to historicize the ableist bent of a lot of contemporary vaccination discourse, particularly anti-autism and its relationship to much longer histories of ableism that frame cognitive disability as a fate worse than death by communicable disease. And I'm happy to talk more about that project in the Q&A. But it was during the research for this project that I began thinking about this second project on the histories of chronic pain. I remember encountering the scientific work of Thomas Beddoes and Humphrey Davy, who famously experimented with nitrous oxide at their Pneumatic Institute toward the end of the 18th century. They believed their pneumatic therapy could be the way of intervening in life-threatening illnesses like consumption via the use of gases, both natural and chemically produced, to influence the body. The last decades of the 18th century saw a rise in the use of opiates, and as Roy Porter once put it, it was as if, quote, the very pain threshold of society was becoming lowered. However, it was the mid-century Victorian experiments with nitrous oxide and the discovery of ether in 1846 that revolutionized surgical practice, and most importantly, they deviated substantially from established frameworks of pain as spiritual trial or pain as a divine omen. Anesthesia bore the possibility of managing or even avoiding pain altogether, when for decades, pain had been the indicator of a body's vitality as it underwent surgery. Had pain effectively become purposeless and therefore subject to chemical interventions even before the event of pain? As someone with scoliosis-related disabilities living with chronic pain, I found this question extremely unsettling for how it speaks to our current opioid crisis, or what we might describe as a greater cultural crisis about what pain means, whose pain gets to matter, and how pain is managed, if at all. The impulse to eliminate or suspend pain urgently demands our rethinking, as this reductive, sloppy approach to pain has been very costly. Those suffering from chronic pain frequently find themselves either ignored by medical professionals or over-medicated to the point of dependency. You either imagine it's not there or you make it go away. Disabled people have historically been figured as being afflicted by and reduced to both psychic and somatic pain as states of abjection that often exceed or destroy language's ability to represent them. And in that latter point, I'm thinking particularly of Elaine Scarry's theory of pain, and I can talk more about that in a little bit. Disability studies and pain studies have rightly tried to emphasize that living with a disability does not necessarily entail pain, nor does pain necessarily have to be experienced as part of a disability or a disability in and of itself. While I want to be clear that not all people in pain necessarily understand themselves to be disabled, I think framing pain in terms of disability helps us expand the ways we think about pain beyond biochemical processes that we can somehow isolate and quote unquote fix. Pain studies embrace of more holistic understandings of pain that do not presume an easy division between physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual pain could be in much greater dialogue with disability studies' long-standing refusal of Cartesian dualism and advocacy for body-minds as complex totalities. Margaret Price, to whom this project is profoundly indebted, has called for a, quote, need to think and talk more carefully about pain, not in order to overcome it, but in order to overcome the many oppressions that attempt to annihilate us for feeling pain. Through readings of 18th and 19th century British literary, philosophical, medical, and scientific sources, I work toward what Alison Patsavis has called a cripistemology of pain. And these are Patsavis's words. Quote, "It is my hope that cripistemologies materialize in ways that permit us to think pain otherwise, to produce painful new knowledge, but also to construct analyses about pain that are less painful and less dangerous to those of us in pain, and in doing so, to reimagine our shared pained futures," end quote. The move to cripistemologies has involved reconceptualizing the very ways of knowing we take for granted in our fields of study. How are our analytical structures themselves ableist, that even in studies of disability topics, we marginalize disabled lived experience and foreclose the possibility that pain has something to teach us in its own crip ways? To frame this differently, can we more carefully historicize a standpoint theory, or to use Rosemary Garland Thompson's feminist reformulation of this term, sit point theory of pain, that can more compassionately and justly address the very queer, and I use queer very deliberately here, queer chronicities of pain, while also advocating for better forms of care and interdependence. I'm also using the word chronicity here very deliberately. What do we actually mean when we say chronic pain? What temporal models do we have for thinking about pain and its treatment? When bouts or flare-ups of pain occur, the typical narrative is that we turn to pain relievers of increasing strength to mitigate those pains, but any pain not manageable by medication, pain that leads to excessive medication, or pain that persists despite medicine, all fall under the category of chronic. Chronic in these usages suggest interminability, unknowable duration, or perpetual ceaseless pain. As medical professionals have themselves begun to admit, the pathology of chronic pain is also a byproduct of biomedicine's own fetishizing of teleological narratives of curative resolution rather than palliative care. This temporal framing, what Alison Kafer aptly calls curative time, imagines illness and disability following a linear trajectory in which such conditions are expected to be ameliorated, cured, or even eliminated. Intrinsic to what disability scholars have called the medical model of disability, this enduring framework, quote, not only expects and assumes intervention, but also cannot imagine or comprehend anything other than intervention. And those were Kafer's words. As a result, non-curative approaches like palliative care still remain outside this curative imaginary precisely because they get framed as wastes of time and resources and without clear and, dare I say it, billable outcomes. In a 19th century context, when medicine itself was professionalizing, social Darwinism fed directly into later eugenic arguments for the institutionalization and genocide of disabled people. Disabled bodies in pain are always understood to be out of time, both out of sync with time deviations in the progress narrative toward cure, but quite literally running out of time for life itself. To that end, this project is interested in a cripistemology of chronic pain that accounts for its crip time. What Mary Lisa Johnson, to whom my own crip consciousness as someone living with scoliosis-related disability, I owe deeply, has described of her scoliosis as, quote, episodic, not linear, a matter of intensity, sensations, and situations. Crip time deliberately refuses the expectations of able-bodiedness and able-mindedness and the harmful fantasies of a pain-free existence to instead understand pain on its own idiosyncratic terms that might challenge our own limited vocabularies and force us to develop new painful languages that are in fact less hurtful. A fair critique of disability studies has been its presentism. So much of disability theory and disability scholarship continues to focus on the 20th century or later. which is partly because disability only begins to become a legible political identity category around this time, and the very genres of disability life writing begin to proliferate. I want to be extremely clear. I do not intend to abandon such presentist stakes in this project, nor do I want to disavow the fact that I'm thinking in a presentist way. I think turning toward 18th and 19th century transformations in the definition of pain and strategies for its management provides a crucial set of histories for what feel like new crises. When do we stop hand-wringing over how bad the opioid epidemic seems to have gotten and stop sidestepping the historical formations of the very cultures of pain that made possible such epidemic in the first place? As Javier Moscoso has suggested, quote, pain's cultural centrality does not only take place in the biomedical sphere. How do we attend to pain's arrhythmias, let alone pain's arrhythmias in history? This is perhaps a byproduct of my specific experiences in graduate school, where these conversations were particularly central, but I've been trying to think seriously about the issue of methodology and what it means to do crip work historically. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to be interviewed by a fellow disability studies colleague, Grayson Brillmeyer, who is currently working on a project, or actually a series of projects, about how disabled people experience and relate to their representation in archives. For Brillmeyer, a critical disability methodology at the archive, quote, underscores how those multiple social, cultural, and ideological systems have produced records about disabled people, while also emphasizing the granular ways in which values and omissions are also created and embodied within archives and their processes. Such methodology, quote, not only allows me to think about the systems of devaluation that produce certain types of records, but also how those values become embedded in archives. To phrase that slightly differently, thinking about archives as quite literally objects that are constituted by certain value judgments about disability. I think all of this resonates really powerfully with disability activist and writer Eli Clare's moving reflections on his encounter with the archival history of Carrie Buck, whose case before the US Supreme Court, Buck v. Bell, declared compulsory sterilization laws constitutional. Quote, I want a history that leans into Carrie's voice, he writes in response to the fragmented record of American eugenics at work. It is a painful work of witnessing, made even more painful if done ethically. And the following is Clare's reflection on this, and this is a long passage from there. Quote, sometimes all the medical industrial complex leaves behind are case files. That scramble of charts, letters, clinical notes, diagnoses, photographs, birth and death certificates, and court orders used to track people's lives through medical care and confinement. In the era before electronic records, these files reduced countless body minds to paper and ink, stored in vaults, drawers, and boxes upon boxes. Now the same reduction happens in bits and bytes stored on computers. These files, whatever form they take, possess power. They document, prove, and defend treatment and cure. They transform people into diagnoses and quote unquote expert opinions. Tellingly, they are called case files, not personal files. Personhood itself receding. Thousands of stories vanish beneath their authority. And again, those are Clare's words. Now, it goes without saying that archival spaces are so often inaccessible. But as a disabled scholar attempting to access those spaces in hopes of finding crip kinship, it feels that much more fraught because I don't know what I'll find, if I find anything at all. When I read the experiences of disabled people, like 18th century parliamentarian and man of letters William Hay, it is simultaneously a moment of moving identification and also trauma bound up with the alienating feeling of historical distance. Hay's startling defense of disability as benefit and boon accompanies horrific accounts of his objectification and marginalization by both loved ones and figures of authority. I am invested in learning to better read for crip flourishing as much as I have been trained to look for crip suffering. If, quote, conceptualizing sickness and disability centers the layers of unknowability within our experiences, and these are Grayson Brillmeyer's words, I'm left meditating on some crucial questions that similarly animate Brillmeyer's methodology. What may not be legible? What's worth the energy it takes to explain? And ultimately, what may be simply unexplainable? These are all, of course, also poetic questions. Much of my creative work has been an attempt to inhabit, think alongside, through, with, and beside my pain that can so often feel illegible and unknowable. In my recent essay on disability poetics, I described the work of poetry as an attending to pain's own inconsistencies, its dissonances, its contradictions, and even its pleasures, to produce knowledge about pain that builds from pain itself. I have become increasingly invested in the work of careful description, of knowing the contours of my pain without judgment or even meaning making that insists on pain having to serve a purpose. In case it wasn't clear, I'm in fact not a poet by training. This, in many ways, was a byproduct of my experiences in graduate school, where I was consistently told to sideline my creative work for the more urgent work that I was accepted into the program to do, literary criticism and scholarship. For years, I saw these two aspects of my writing life as separate, such that I remained fairly closeted about my poetry because I always felt like a dilettante who neither went through the creative writing workshop process in undergrad, nor came to my grad program explicitly to study poetry and poetics. It always felt like a choice I had to make, either be a serious scholar or be a poet. I also turned to poetry in graduate school out of anger and deep frustration with the very restrictive conventions of academic writing that so often conforms to what I often refer to as the refute and replace model of scholarship. While I'm not interested in intervening in the very fraught post-critique debates, I think the antagonistic mode of scholarship that is encouraged both by scarcity and competition in the neoliberal academy creates forms of scholarly relation that, to me, inhibit the work of really being in conversation with one another. The way I typically frame this is pedagogically. In the classroom, we teach our students how to enter into scholarly conversations, but so often this plays out in the field in ways that are not generative and open, but about shutting down, exposing, rejecting, defining your position by negation. For me, poetry was in contrast the space where I could theorize and speculate without the expectations of argumentative certainty, and where I could coexist with the panoply of different voices I was encountering in theory and literature. It was also where I could describe and inhabit my lived experience, which was so often framed as quote unquote distracting or unnecessary in proper scholarly writing. There was something particularly perverse about how I was being trained to write as if I were a disembodied, distant, and disinterested person, a bad writerly sleight of hand that disavowed the fact that a body mind is in fact doing the labor of thought and communicating ideas. My later years of graduate school were when I started to realize disability studies was a field asking questions I had long been trying to ask in the first place, and providing the conceptual vocabulary to begin speculating on answers that could also help me make sense of what I was living. A colleague of mine, after reading one of the very first pieces I published as a poet, asked me very simply, "Why do you insist on thinking about your poetry and research as separate?" I've suggested to you already why I did separate them for so many years, but my colleague framed it to me in a way I simply had not truly considered at that point. How had my poetic work enabled me to ask different questions and think differently about the history of embodiment and its relationship to literature in my scholarship? How has disability studies informed how I do the work of poetry and how I understand poetry to interact with disabled experience? Understanding these projects as mutually constitutive has transformed not only my writing process, but also the stakes of why I do both. As I suggested in my interview with Ruben Quesada recently for the Kenyon Review, poetry has become a means of my own cripistemology, of speculating from the very embody-minded experience of scoliosis-related disability and chronic pain without the expectation of resolution or transformative insight. My poetry seldom declares. Instead, it describes. It inhabits, it questions, even if that begets more questions, because that is what good poetry does. To put this in the late Yvonne Boland's words, which I've long held as a mantra for my own work, quote, poetry begins where certainty ends. It goes without saying that this is all painful work. To have written this talk, to be delivering it to you now as my spine continues to curve and the surrounding muscle and tissue tighten. And I struggle a little more to take deeper breaths as the positioning of my rib cage inhibits the fuller expansion of my lungs. Poetry became a way for me to pay better attention to the chronicities of my body and to acknowledge what it actually takes for me to write, to acknowledge it, what I do as labor. The very first of my crip experiments with poetry was to mark the moments when pain arrived at the scene of my writing. Slashes that punctuate the lines, line breaks whenever I would lose a train of thought or feel too much pain to continue. I wanted to concretize what attends me at my desk, what we in this profession and in publishing are asked to disavow because it does not rehearse trauma in ways that are marketable and palatable. What might it actually mean to write about pain that does not conform to the templates we are given about how to write about immigrant pain, queer pain, disabled pain? Pain that is not simply trauma porn, or worse yet, reducible to narratives of overcoming that reinscribe me as a model minority, as the good crip that is not limited by his disabilities and able to overcompensate, or the good queer who proves it really somehow does get better. I wanted to write to expand what was being written about pain that perversely reinscribed certain forms of pain as the pain we're somehow supposed to feel and also talk about in prescribed and overdetermined ways. I came to resent writing about pain that really was not about pain at all, but about its necessary transformation or its beautification so it isn't just all ugly. What about pain for pain's sake? To write and publish poems formed in pain, suffused by pain, also meant being in pain in public. Readers invited to interpret my body, and in many cases make diagnostic assumptions about my body, my somehow mismanagement of it, and to lament its tragic deformity. I've been thinking a lot about the work of ethical witnessing, especially with pain. How do I witness my own pain ethically and relinquish any sense of defensive ownership over my pain once I've released it into the world? Is my pain my own anymore? Or is that precisely the point? To have done what Lane Scarry believes is impossible, the communication of pain that can be shared with others. To put it very simply, I believe a lot in this shared vulnerable work, in finding kinship with others whose pain I may never fully know but still honor. I thank you for your time today, and I look forward to our conversation ahead. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Travis. It's a pleasure to get to listen to your work and just spend time together today. What I want to invite everyone to do is please share questions with us in the Q&A. I have a few questions to start us off. And again, I want to invite you to think about the many topics that Travis has proposed to us related to his work and current events and to history, and to also kind of share what's on your mind related to disability and accessibility and disability studies generally as a field. So Travis, just to kick things off a little bit, I feel like you hinted at how this practice of embodiment or awareness of body-mind points us towards interdependence and advocacy. And I'm wondering, like, if you could just talk a little bit more about how you've experienced that and what you hope for your students or others engaged with your writing.
I think this is such a big question, and one that I feel like I thought I had answers for, but I feel less and less clear that I do. And I think to think about this more pedagogically, I think a lot of what underpins my teaching is this very deliberate creation of discomfort in the classroom, but not discomfort for discomfort's sake, but thinking about how that discomfort can be shared and then also framed in ways that can be productive. I've been thinking a lot about this ethical problem where I've had colleagues of mine, some students of mine say, wow, you teach a lot of really painful topics. How do we avoid the problem of reproducing the trauma of those encounters while also sometimes having difficult conversations that we need to have because those encounters are painful? And I think a lot of the time, I'm really averse to the kind of either or conversation where you shouldn't do it at all, or you should just embrace that it's going to be painful. I think it's about framing and preparing the class as a community to do that work. And I think you can tell from the way that I talk and do my research, it's very much a dialogic process. And I think the pandemic has made super clear to me that this process has to be interdependent. It has to be a kind of mutual reliance on the fact that some of us are going to be more capable or more able in that moment to engage with this material than in other times, and that our experiences of disability or simply being in our bodies will fluctuate. And having space for that flexibility and for that grace, I think, is something that the Academy doesn't like to provide, sadly, so that we have to kind of carve spaces for sometimes at great expense. And that's something that I myself, as a disabled faculty member, am super aware of as someone who is still in the early part of his career, not fully sure how to do that. But it really occurs to me that rather than thinking about this as an individual project, it's one about collective imagination, how we can do this as communities rather than thinking about individuals making their own class more accessible or their work more accessible. How do we think about a paradigm shift more broadly toward a more interdependent and accessible way of being in the Academy, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful. I'm just reading through our chat and I see that there's a question from Jeremy Colangelo, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering your last name. And I think he would like you to talk a little bit more about Elaine Scarry. And I think you'll have some of us in your audience that know a lot about Elaine Scarry and others that maybe are not familiar with her work.
Yeah, so thanks, Jeremy, for that question. In some ways, you have intuited quite right that I have in some ways spent my entire career responding to Scarry's work. Just for some clarity for folks in the room who may not know who Elaine Scarry is, Elaine Scarry wrote a book in 1985 called The Body and Pain, and it put forth a theory of pain as that which destroys language. This idea that pain cannot be communicated because the person in pain and the person witnessing them have this chasm of difference and a barrier to understanding intimately what that pain is. So as a result, the person in pain experiences it in a way that the person perceiving it cannot. And I've been really troubled by that dominant theory of pain because on the one hand, for me, and especially in the experiences that I had as a person living with chronic pain and in the communities that I'm in, I don't think of pain as destroying language at all. I think what we're actually coming up against is the limitations of language that we have currently for talking about pain. So rather than saying, I think making this grand claim that pain destroys language, I think what we need to be better doing is attending to the ways that people in pain talk about their pain, expanding the kinds of metaphors and languages that we have, and thinking about the ways in which we are actually impeding on multiple levels, societally, politically, culturally, the expansion of that vocabulary in the first place. So whenever I teach this kind of material in health humanities classes or disability studies classes, I'm really invested in having my students, and in this case, many of my colleagues, I'm really invested in them exploring the really broad range of writing about pain that to me is hardly this sense of language being disintegrated or annihilated, but actually a profusion or an effusion of language that I think as a culture we're really bad at listening to and attending to. So I think the byproduct of a kind of theories like Scarry's is that it gets around, to me, a lot of the more structural inequities and social and political reasons why pain and the people who talk about it get denied or rejected. This is a question I'm really interested in following up on and thinking about other people who've engaged with Scary's work, because I know a lot of people disagree with me in terms of my reading of Scary, but I think this comes a little bit from a disability justice approach too, where I'm wanting to listen to people for whom pain is a lived experience. For the people that I know at least and have interacted with, I think they would hardly describe their experience as having language annihilated. And I think the sort of marked absence of disability in Scary's work in 1985, which I will not fault her for because it is of that particular moment, I think it's telling, right, that pain and disability have not been thought about enough together. And as a result, it reflects in that kind of theory.
We have a question that in our Q&A from Megan Roberts, and I'll just read it aloud. It says, Travis, thank you for this wonderful talk. I'd love to hear more about the connections between 18th and 19th century use of opioid and other contemporary opioid crises, especially pain as something to fear, pain as something to embrace. And I'm thinking here of Catholic saints live, especially Teresa of Avila. And Megan, I think here is doing a shout out to her early modernist friend. So thinking even further back prior to the 18th century.
This is such a great question, Megan. This is where I feel like the project is in kind of an exciting moment of really sort of expanding its scope. My instinct, of course, is to think about as I mentioned, the rise of anesthesia as a way of thinking about paradigm shifts. But I think in order to tell that story more compellingly and more fully, we have to inevitably think about the inherited ways that by the 18th century we've been structured to think about pain. And one of those ways is a religious framework, what I might describe as both a juridical and a religious framework in which pain is simultaneously a kind of spiritual teacher that if we withstand and overcome will make us more enlightened and knowledgeable, right? That model of pain, but also the more punitive pain as divine trial. And what I want to sort of think about is how sometimes the history we narrate about pain and its medicalization is a weirdly kind of Whiggish, progress-oriented one, where somehow we shift from this argument about pain being a kind of divine spiritual trial. It suddenly gives way to medicalization the moment anesthesia happens. I think a more sort of complex way of thinking about this is that those two things start to coexist and become sublimated into one another. So even medicalized understandings of pain still inherit some of that moralizing and culturally received ways of thinking about pain. But I think for me, why anesthesia is so important is that because anesthesia can simply medicalize or medicate pain away, it led to a kind of crisis where pain didn't have that religious and spiritual meaning quite in the same way anymore, because it could quite literally be erased. So this is something that Rachel Ablow talks about in her book, Victorian Pain, where there was a crisis in whether or not pain meant anything anymore, whether or not it was a meaningless event that was reducible to a kind of medical experience that could be erased or at least ameliorated. And I wonder if we're sort of tying it to the other part of your question about how we arrived at our current opioid epidemic, the ways in which pain is framed as this utterly undesirable state of being. I think that's something that is slightly a byproduct of that transition with anesthesia, but also the idea that either you annihilate it or fix it so that you don't feel it as much really speaks to the ways in which pain has been framed a very particular way that lends itself, one, to the market logics of healthcare, but also this idea that we shouldn't be feeling pain much at all. I'm thinking about even the way pain medications and the way sort of popular culture likes to represent pain as something that you just kind of get rid of, the language of painkillers, that a normal, able-bodied, healthy person shouldn't be feeling any form of pain at all. And I find this to actually have much more significant ramifications for how we look at that stuff in history. And I think if we look at it from, say, 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century contexts, I think there was actually a much more capacious way of thinking about pain that's really lost. And as much as I am loath to make a kind of reductive argument to say that this is a cultural amnesia, I like to think that there's something there that we need to recover in history, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Travis, and thanks for the great question. Megan, I'm seeing a few new questions popping up in the chat. Thais Carillo, I will read your question out loud. Bowdoin has unfortunately switched back to the mindset that Zoom is not equivalent to in-person school, leaving students like myself struggling on painful days, or at least we could at least join a class through Zoom. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the ideas we have as a society, about presence and community and attention.
What a generative question, and one that actually I am addressing as we speak in my own classes. At Kenyon, we are fully in person, and Kenyon has been committed to this since the beginning of this academic year. And you can imagine for disabled faculty members, this has been a struggle, especially as we've had to navigate different forms of accommodation in order to have classes remote. We had the brief luxury, I think, of having the first 2 weeks this semester where the instructor was given the choice to have their classes be remote. But ultimately, the spirit of how the college wants to proceed is that it is in person as the norm. And as a result, I think we have been put in this difficult position where currently there are a significant amount of cases on campus, and many of my students are actually unable to make it, not just because they are close contacts, but because quarantine prevents them from attending class. And now I'm in this position of having conversations with them about shifting briefly to a virtual modality. And I could rant about this too, because I feel like as a disabled faculty member, I'm navigating this very differently than some of my able-bodied colleagues. But I think the way I'll respond to this is that there isn't a clear answer. I want to be really clear too that the virtual modality is not necessarily accessible to everyone or necessarily more accessible, but a means of being somewhat more accessible for certain people. And I think what we're not having the conversation about is how to maximize accessibility in as many ways as possible. So thinking about what actually providing the resources to do a truly hybrid setup where we can both accommodate the in-person class, right, to do so safely, but then also have Zoom modalities to accommodate students who cannot attend or do not feel safe attending. I think these are questions that we don't want to have in our return to normal. And you can imagine from a disability standpoint how irritating the use of the word normal is here, and the now cliche response to that, which is how normal was normal before, if we're trying to return to it. I also think more broadly, my response to that too, the words you used in your question were about presence, community, and attention. A lot of instructors I know think that they're having to do this stuff unilaterally, but another thing I might offer is that we should all be doing this as classroom communities, right? I'm making this decision to go virtual, not by myself, but in conversation with my students, asking them what their access needs are, or how the shift to the virtual may actually hinder their access to the material, and how I can go about that too. Of course, a lot of us are doing this without the requisite training because we've been sort of forced to go virtual. And it really occurs to me, right, to really address the ways in which we've been thrust in this position, often not with the resources we need, And we are doing what I think many of my colleagues who have rightly called it this, they're right in doing so, is emergency remote teaching. We are still in this place of emergency remote teaching, and I want us to recognize that in the first place, but also think about ways we can learn from this experience and not try to return to some arbitrary healthy normal where we somehow did better teaching then, but move toward a new future that is more, at least more thoughtful about how access looks like, not just for students, but also for faculty. And maybe that's a long way of me saying I don't have a super clear answer, but that it is something that we have to do more collectively rather than as individuals.
And I think this is a good time for us to plug a topic that I know that we are both fans of, and it's the Disability Visibility Project, and kind of the tagline of access is love, just as a way to respond to some of the points that you are making in your question. As a related couple of questions that I'm seeing popping up is about this topic of creative responses to pain and disability. And so both what faculty members or artists can do to foster more freedom and accessibility to create this work, and also some curiosity around maybe other forms of art that you've engaged with.
This is such a great question. My instinct here is to think about an art movement that has been sort of leading the way for thinking about access, and that's the dance community. So I'm thinking a lot about my colleague Petra Kupper's work. Petra's at the University of Michigan, and I think Petra's work really embodies the ways in which dance is actually really at the forefront of a lot of these conversations about accessibility. I'm thinking about all the showcases of disabled dancers and the ways in which choreography can be a way of fostering access intimacy, if we want to think about that term. If access is a form of love, I think the proximity of bodies, particularly in dance culture, has been a really great place for thinking about that particular question. But I was thinking about Jesse's question in the chat about how we can foster more creative freedom and accessibility so that we can think about our work as enabling the kind of expression, and I like the word you use here, decompression, of maybe experiences like ableism. Something that I do, and I'm the first to admit my bias as a literary scholar, is to think about where my students' disciplines are. My classrooms are very interdisciplinary, and I think they are a little bit less so now because I'm teaching in an English department where our courses are almost overwhelmingly English majors. But when I teach courses like literature, medicine, and culture, which I'm teaching this semester, I have a lot of STEM students, and many of them are actually interested in the arts, but don't always have ways of doing so. So a lot of my ways of framing assignments is to prompt them to work in a medium that they're not so used to. This next week, we're going to be going to the museum on campus called the Gun Gallery, and we're going to be looking at the history of HIV/AIDS. And particularly, we happen to have Latinx artists work on campus, and I'm going to be prompting a lot of my students to move away from textual analysis to think about objects and visual culture. And this is one, to push myself out of that comfort of working with conventional literary texts, but also giving my students an opportunity to respond in ways that are not just verbal or rhetorical or textual, but having them produce forms of art or visual responses to the artwork they're engaging with, if only to expand the way they close read, right? So how do they close read visual text versus sort of written verbal text, but also encouraging them to potentially tap into creative interests and instincts that they have, especially if they too are navigating illness and disability. And I find that actually a lot of students, this is something that I find really beautiful and moving about my teaching, is students end up disclosing their experiences in ways I would have never expected. And it's never an expectation in my classroom, but when students feel comfortable and safe doing so, and do so through my course's assignments, I feel like that's a moment of great success. So that's how I think I would respond to that question.
Thank you so much. All right, you have a question from Anne Kibbe, who's going to point you to the 18th century. And particularly, she would love to hear you talk about Alexander Pope and in relationship to disability studies.
It's so lovely to, well, I guess I can't quite see you, Anne, but I can see your question and know that you're here. It's so lovely to be in dialogue with you. And this is a great question regarding Pope. I think the person that I have to reference here in terms of Pope and disability is the work of Helen Deutsch, thinking about her book on Pope's spinal deformity and the way that it shaped his understanding of poetry and poetics. I'm trying to think here about the canon particularly. So whenever I teach sort of introduction to 18th century studies, people have certain preconceived notions about who gets to be called as part of the 18th century. And having been influenced a lot by colleagues in the field, part of the hashtag Bigger Six movement in Romanticism, trying to push beyond the big six writers, I've been really trying to think about how part of that work is not just the kind of token inclusion of women writers or writers of color or disabled writers, but in this case, revising the ways that we present even the canon, right? So what would it mean to think about Pope not as a neoclassical writer, not as sort of a key writer in the 18th century who innovated the use of the heroic couplet, but to think about him as very much a disabled writer who is in dialogue with the increasing codification of ableism, not just in culture, but in politics as well. This to me is this kind of shift in my teaching that I have to admit my own limits of how I was taught. And also the work of being very deliberate about how I frame canonical writers. Another way that I've learned a lot from my colleagues who are, for instance, teaching Romantic era writing in terms of revolution and the transatlantic slave trade and abolition has been about situating in terms of background what the conditions are for certain pieces to have been written, right? So what would it mean to think about Pope's essay on man or any number of Pope's works? I'm even thinking about the Rape of the Lock, and one, to code it as commentaries on disability, but then also to talk about it in terms of, say, the rise of disability as a concept, the shifting lexicon surrounding disability. What would it mean to teach that work in that context particularly? And I think the truth is I haven't yet, as I've just sort of stepped into my role here at Kenyon, I haven't yet had an opportunity to really develop that version of the curriculum yet, but I think you've pointed me to the real need to do so, and how, and I say this a lot in my classrooms, how what I'm teaching is one of many 18th centuries rather than the 18th century, capital T, E, and C, but one of many possible versions of the historical period that I'm trying to present to my students.
So nuanced and thoughtful. I'll read it aloud.
Sam.
We have one more question coming in from an anonymous attendee. What are changes in policy you would like to see to increase accessibility for those experiencing chronic pain and to shift the ways that medical professionals approach pain?
This is, I think, probably one of the hardest but most urgent questions we have to address, which is, I think, so two things. One is, I think one of the easy critiques of disability theory is that, well, how does theory translate into praxis? And I really appreciate your question, which was not about sort of broadly or abstractly, how do we even begin to make changes? You asked very specifically, what are changes in policy you would like to see? And I think on the one hand, I'm interested in sort of thinking about the ways in which theory and praxis are related, how disability theory and disability studies is often missing in conversations about policy because we're often not invited into those conversations in the first place. So on the one hand, it's an access issue. To sort of better address this, I also think one of the things that we don't do very well as a community, especially in academia, is sort of take seriously where needs actually are, right? So one of the things that I've been advocating, and I gestured toward this at the beginning of my talk, is one of the ways in which the accessibility conversation is almost always exclusively talked about in terms of students. But what ends up happening is that disability is presumed to not affect other groups, staff, for instance, or faculty. And if our conversation is not even engaging the many people whose lives are affected by issues like access, and hint, hint, that's everyone, we're actually not having a full conversation in the first place. If I were to offer some specific examples of policy, I think here it would have to be a move toward better universal design. And I want to be clear that universal design is not a catch-all or solution for everything, but a set of principles for us to think about how to maximize accessibility. Given the fact that even on my campus, for instance, at Kenyon, our very sort of crucial main walkway, which we call the middle path, is inaccessible, is really, to me, illustrative of the ways in which campuses don't see accessibility as a priority. It is a thing you tack on at the end of the list. I talked recently at a conference about the sort of laundry listing in the name of diversity, which has now become a kind of marketable thing at institutions, right? Where now we just add accessibility or disability as that extra item on this list of marginalized identities. We get included on that list, but do substantive changes happen? Not typically. And I think there are actually very real and substantive things we can do on the ground from not just this endless project of retrofitting, which a lot of colleges and universities are reluctant to do, even though they're bound by the ADA to do it. But I'm thinking also about teaching practices and having, for instance, what would it mean if a bunch of new faculty and existing and current faculty were trained in universal design and expected to institute those in their teaching? What would it mean to measure that and to track that and to see how that impacts student retention and student outcomes, and not just the accommodation question. And I could go on about the many ways I might think about this issue, but I think this is harkening back to my first response, which is this has to be a paradigm shift first before we can sort of think about what specific strategies are going to be most helpful. The people who need most to be a part of the conversation are often not.
Thank you, Travis. You are doing exactly the work that all of us hope this series will do, which is to speak to emergent and really rich scholarship, but also to think about the relationship between scholarship and practice. And in that spirit, I want to invite Bowdoin faculty who happen to be in this webinar to join me in 2 weeks, where we're going to be doing a forum on assistive technology to put into practice some of what we're talking about today. And that's going to be led by Yuli Hogan. And I also want to invite you to email me or to email David Hecht if you have ideas for speakers or topics that you would like to see covered in our future disability and accessibility lectures. And to close, I just want to say thank you again to Travis. We're so grateful to have you as part of this series and for the work that you are doing.
It means so much to be here. And thanks everyone for the really thoughtful questions. Y'all kept me on my toes. I will be thinking a lot about these questions. And of course, for those of you who didn't have a moment to speak today, my inbox is yours. So feel free to touch base. And I'm sure Margaret is happy to share my email if you need it.